The fastest way to stay middle class is to treat every debt like it deserves the same urgency. That is where I want to begin, because most people have been taught something that sounds responsible and is often financially destructive. They have been taught that debt is debt, that good people get rid of it quickly, and that the cleanest life is the one with the fewest balances on the page. That sounds noble. It also confuses morality with mathematics, and whenever people confuse morality with mathematics and money, mathematics wins quietly, relentlessly, without ever bothering to explain itself. I have watched this happen for decades. A hardworking man gets a little extra cash and throws it at a 3.5% mortgage because he wants the emotional reward of saying he is closer to owning the house outright. A smart young woman sends every spare dollar to a moderate federal student loan because she has been told debt freedom is the first step to wealth, even while she ignores her employer match and loses the best compounding years of her life. A couple rushes to kill a cheap auto loan because they hate the payment while they postpone investing, keep weak liquidity, and stay one bad surprise away from falling right back into expensive consumer debt. Then years go by. They feel responsible, they feel disciplined, they feel like adults, yet when you look at the balance sheet, the investments are too small, the cash reserves are too thin, the optionality is too weak, and the future is not much safer than it should be after all that effort. That is the crime. Not that they worked hard, that they worked hard in the wrong order. The source document you gave me is really about that misordering. On the surface it says to stop aggressively paying down 3 kinds of debt. But the deeper and much more valuable point is that capital has a cost hierarchy. Some liabilities are so cheap that extra payments on them are a low return use of scarce dollars, while other liabilities are so toxic that every month they remain alive, they are actively devouring future wealth. Fayfelicite, Fay-Turn-66, File 0 Fay. That is the truth people need to hear. The game is not be debt-free. The game is deploy capital where it changes net worth fastest. Those are very different games, and if you want to build real wealth, not just the emotional appearance of tidiness, you have to learn the difference. I think about debt the same way I think about any capital decision. What does this money cost me? What can that same money earn elsewhere? What flexibility do I lose by locking capital here? What risk am I removing? What risk am I creating? And what is the real spread between the price of this liability and the probable return of my next best alternative? That is the adult language of money. Most people never learn it. They learn the childhood version. Debt bad, pay it off, feel clean, move on. Unfortunately, the market does not reward cleanliness. It rewards correct sequencing. That is what this whole conversation is about. Not tricks, not rebellion, not being clever for its own sake. Correct sequencing. So let me tell you what I believe after a lifetime of watching people build fortunes, lose fortunes, and stay stuck right in the middle because they kept doing respectable things in financially stupid order. There are cheap debts that should usually be left on schedule. There are moderate debts that require context. There are poisonous debts that must be annihilated with no sentiment and no delay. And the person who cannot tell which is which will spend years kneeling in front of the wrong altar. Now, before I get to the 3 categories people overpay most often, I want to give you the master rule. A dollar is never just a dollar. A dollar sent to debt principal earns a return equal to the interest rate avoided. A dollar sent into a good business, a broad market index, a retirement match, or a tax-advantaged compounding machine may earn a very different return. A dollar left liquid can buy you optionality, time, and survival under stress. That means each dollar has competing jobs. If you ignore the competition and simply send every extra dollar to the balance that annoys you most emotionally, then you are not allocating capital. You are self-soothing. Self-soothing can be expensive. The source text says this in its own sharper language. It argues that many people lump mortgage debt, student debt, car debt, and consumer debt into one ugly pile and then throw extra money at whatever feels urgent or virtuous. Its criticism is correct. That approach ignores the true cost of capital and the opportunity cost of what those same dollars could be doing instead. Fay-Filicite, Fay-Turn-66, File 0 Fay, that is exactly right. So let us begin with the first debt people are paying too aggressively, the low-interest mortgage. This one is emotionally powerful because the house is never just a liability. It is memory, it is adulthood, it is stability. It is often the single largest thing a family has ever been approved to buy, which means it carries enormous symbolic weight. That is why people are so vulnerable to bad advice here. A father hears, "Pay off your house as fast as you can," and thinks he is hearing wisdom passed down from a generation that understood sacrifice. Sometimes he is hearing fear passed down from a generation that did not have the same access to capital markets, the same index fund tools, the same tax shelters, or the same long-duration, cheap fixed financing. A slogan survives much longer than the world it was built for. That is what is happening here. If you locked in a mortgage at 2.5%, 3%, 3.5%, or even something modestly higher during the low-rate era, then you are sitting on one of the cheapest long-term liabilities most households will ever see. That matters because cheap fixed debt is not simply an obligation. It is also a privilege. It allows you to keep capital elsewhere while inflation, time, and amortization quietly do part of the work for you. The source document says this plainly. It points out that if your mortgage sits below roughly 5%, then every extra dollar you send to principal is effectively earning only that mortgage rate, while historically broad productive assets have earned materially more over long periods. It uses the contrast between a 3.5% mortgage and long-run equity, like returns to make the opportunity. Cost case Fay file site Fay turn 66 file 0 Fay, that is the heart of the argument. If I can retire capital at 3.5%, but I have the realistic ability over time to invest that same capital into productive assets that may compound closer to 8%, 9%, or 10%. Why would I choose the smaller return unless I had a compelling reason beyond emotion? This is where people say, because I want peace of mind. Fine, peace of mind matters. But you should at least admit what you are purchasing. You are not purchasing mathematical superiority. You are purchasing emotional simplicity. Sometimes that is worth paying for, but call it what it is. Do not dress it up as universally optimal. There is another issue here that almost no one explains clearly enough. Liquidity. The person who takes every extra dollar and buries it inside the house is not simply reducing interest expense. He is converting liquid optionality into trapped equity. That is a huge difference. Equity in a house looks wonderful on a spreadsheet. It is not equally wonderful when the roof needs replacing, the job goes away, the market corrects, or a genuine investment opportunity appears, and the capital you need is now locked inside walls, title paperwork, lender conditions, and transaction friction. The source material hints at this too. Its larger point is that a household can become overcommitted to the emotional goal of paying off the house, while underbuilding the liquid assets that create real resilience and opportunity. That distinction is absolutely correct. Fay file site Fay turn 66 file 0 Fay. That is why I often say that a paid-off house can coexist with a fragile life. No mortgage, wonderful, but also no large brokerage account, no serious reserve, no flexible capital, no ability to act under stress. That is not what I call strength. Strength is having a cheap liability and strong liquid assets at the same time. That is much harder to build. It is also much more powerful. Now, I want to be careful because people love abusing nuance. I am not saying take out a foolish mortgage. I am not saying finance too much house. I am not saying adjustable. Rate debt is your friend just because you heard me defend cheap debt. I am saying something narrower and much more practical. If you already possess low-cost fixed mortgage debt, then extra principal payments often deserve a very low place in the capital hierarchy. That is the point. Not houses do not matter. Not debt is good. But cheap long-term fixed debt often has better alternative uses for capital than early retirement. That is what adults hear when they listen carefully. Now let us move to the second debt people overpay too early. Federal student loans. This category is emotionally charged for a different reason. A mortgage at least gives the borrower a house to look at. Student debt gives the borrower memories, maybe skills, maybe earning power, and maybe also resentment. A great many people hate their student debt with a force that is more psychological than mathematical. I understand that. It feels like adulthood began with a handicap. It feels like every step forward was taxed by a younger self who borrowed against a future that was not fully visible yet. All of that is real, but hatred is not an allocation framework. And the question is still the same. What is the true cost of this debt relative to the value of what I am sacrificing by attacking it aggressively? The source document is strongest here when it points out that many people in their 20s and 30s throw every extra dollar at federal student debt while doing little or nothing for retirement, missing employer matches, building no emergency fund, and delaying the most valuable compounding years of their lives, underneath the provocative phrasing that insight is absolutely correct. Fay file site Fay turn 66 file 0 Fay, that is the real damage. A dollar invested at 25 is not the same dollar as one invested at 45. People say that sentence all the time without actually respecting it. I respect it deeply because time is not just a variable in compounding. It is the variable if two people both eventually invest. But one started 20 years earlier. The older dollars often do more of the heavy lifting than the later dollars ever can. That means your early investing years are not just nice to have, they are disproportionately important. Now consider the mistake. A young professional carries federal student loans at 4%, 5%, maybe 6% or 7%, instead of taking the employer match, instead of opening the Roth IRA, instead of building a cash reserve, instead of letting early market ownership begin compounding. The person makes double and triple payments into student debt because debt freedom feels morally urgent. That is often a major sequencing error. Not because student loans are wonderful, because the years being sacrificed on the asset side are irreplaceable. The source text says the same thing in plain English. It notes that the best early move is often to make minimum federal loan payments while first capturing the 401k, match building liquidity, and funding tax advantaged accounts. Because those moves can produce superior long run value. Fay turn 66, file 0 Fay. Exactly. And let us talk about that employer match because nothing reveals a broken capital hierarchy faster than a worker skipping free money to attack a moderate loan. If your employer says, put in 6% and I will match part or all of that, then that is not another small line item that is immediate return, maybe 50%, maybe 100% on the matched portion. You do not get to ignore that and pretend you are being prudent because you are making extra payments on a 5% federal loan. That is upside down behavior. The match comes first. I do not care how responsible the extra loan payment feels. Feeling responsible is not the same thing as being right. Then comes the emergency fund. This is another thing the aggressive student loan crowd tends to underbuild. And that is dangerous because a person with weak liquidity and no buffer is always one life event away from replacing a moderate rate federal loan with revolting high rate consumer debt. That would be an astonishingly stupid exchange. Yet it happens all the time because people obsessed with erasing one debt category early often leave themselves unprotected from the much more toxic category that shows up when life gets inconvenient. The source document recognizes this too. It recommends building 3 to 6 months of expenses before turning extra firepower back toward moderate student debt, which is exactly the right hierarchy for most ordinary households. Fay turn 66, file 0 Fay. That is because fragility always comes before optimization. A fragile household has no business pretending it is executing elegant debt strategy. It needs resilience first, and federal student loans, while not pleasant, often come with protections other debts do not. Income-driven repayment options, deferral structures, potential forgiveness in certain paths. These features do not make them harmless. They do make them different from naked consumer poison, and different debts deserve different treatment. That is the whole philosophy. Now let us move to the third debt many people overpay for emotional reasons. Low-interest auto loans. This one offends people because they know correctly that cars are depreciating assets. True, but once again, that is not the relevant question. The relevant question is not whether the car goes down in value. It obviously does. The relevant question is whether extra principal payments on a cheap auto loan produce a better return than the alternative uses of the same capital. The answer is often no. The source document states this directly. It says that if the financing cost is low, then paying extra toward the car loan can be inferior to investing that same money, especially over a long horizon, because the avoided interest rate is simply too low compared with the return available from long-term productive assets. Fay turn 66, file 0 Fay. That is exactly how I think about it. A person with a 2%, 3%, or 4% auto note who is financially stable and properly reserved does not become smarter by rushing to kill the note. He becomes tidier. That is different. The right comparison is always spread. What does the debt cost? What can the money do elsewhere? And what optionality do I preserve by keeping the cheap note in place? The answer for a disciplined investor is usually that the money can work much harder outside the car. Of course, there is an important warning attached to this. Most people do not get in trouble because cheap auto debt is mathematically evil. They get in trouble because they bought too much car and then tried to justify it by talking about rates. That is a separate mistake. Buying a vehicle that strains cash flow is bad even if the rate is low. Overbuying a depreciating status object because the payment fits is one of the classic ways the middle class sabotages wealth. So again, listen carefully. I am not defending oversized car purchases. I am defending the idea that once you already hold a sensible low-rate auto loan, extra principal is often a weak use of capital. Those are not the same thing. The source text uses a numerical example to make the case that even a few $100s of extra monthly payment can produce less long-term wealth than sending the same money into a productive investment account. Instead, that example is directionally correct because it forces the reader to compare the avoided interest rate against the potential long-run compounding of invested capital. Fe file site Fe turn 66 file 0 Fe. And that is exactly the comparison that matters. Not but I hate the payment. Not but I want the title free and clear. Not but debt feels bad. What matters is the return hierarchy. If you continue to use emotional disgust as your allocation framework, you will keep overpaying cheap liabilities while underfeeding the assets that actually move you toward financial freedom. Now, let me step back. What do these three debts have in common? Low-rate mortgage, federal student loans, low-rate auto loans. They are not identical, but they do share one essential feature in many households. They are often not the highest and best use of extra capital. That is the connection. The person who starts to understand wealth stops asking, which debt annoys me most? He starts asking, which use of this extra dollar creates the highest long-run improvement in my financial position? That is the pivot from worker thinking to allocator thinking. The source document is trying to teach exactly that, even when it uses a louder style than I would. The real lesson is the true cost of money, not what a balance feels like emotionally, but what that balance costs relative to the return and flexibility available elsewhere. Fe file site Fe turn 66 file 0 Fe. That is the lesson of a lifetime. Once you understand cost of capital, the fog begins to clear. And then the next question becomes obvious. If I stop overpaying those three categories, what should the freed up money do? This is where the hierarchy really matters. The source text lays out a sequence, and beneath the chest, thumping the sequence itself is sound. First, take the employer 401k match, then build the emergency fund, then fund tax, advantaged accounts like the Roth IRA. Then continue strengthening retirement accounts and productive assets, including dividend-oriented holdings, where appropriate. Fe file site Fe turn 66 file 0 Fe. That is the right architecture. The employer match comes first because free money is not optional. You take it. You do not romanticize debt payments while leaving free return on the table. Then the emergency reserve, because fragility ruins everything. Then the Roth IRA, if you are eligible. I love the Roth because it gives ordinary people something rare and beautiful. The chance to build a pool of compounding that the government cannot tax later if handled correctly, that matters. Then the 401k beyond the match, if the broader plan supports it. Then broad productive ownership, low-cost index funds, high-quality businesses, a real compounding machine. The source document places more emphasis on dividends than I would as a blanket prescription, but its deeper instinct is still valuable. Money that is not being wasted on low-return debt prepayments should move toward productive assets that grow, and in time where suitable, throw off cash flow as well. Fe file site Fe turn 66 file 0 Fe. That is exactly right. The point is not that everyone must become a dividend obsessive. The point is that the asset side must start getting fed. Too many households spend years being responsible on the liability side while the asset side remains skeletal. That is a tragic misallocation of effort because ultimately the goal is not to have no debts. The goal is to own enough productive claims that your life becomes less dependent on the next paycheck and less vulnerable to every external shock. That is what wealth is. And that brings us to the final and most important category. The debt that deserves absolutely no philosophical romance, high-interest consumer debt, credit cards with carried balances, personal loans at ugly rates, payday debt, buy, now pay, ladder junk, that behaves like disguised poison. This is where all the nuance ends. The source text is correct to draw a hard line here. It says anything above roughly 8%, and especially the grotesque double-digit rates common on credit cards and consumer loans, should be attacked with total seriousness because the guaranteed return from eliminating that debt is superior to what sensible investing can reliably produce. Fe file site Fe turn 66 file 0 Fe. That is exactly how I see it. If you are carrying 18%, 22%, 25%, 29% debt, then there is no clever conversation left. There is no maybe I should invest instead. Wisdom there is no. But leverage can be a tool, excuse there. That is a different species entirely. A 3.5% mortgage is a strategic liability. A 25% revolving balance is a predator. Do not confuse them. One can coexist with wealth. The other feeds on it. This is one reason I dislike simplistic personal finance slogans. They flatten the world too much. Pay off all debt. Wrong. Use debt strategically. Too vague. The right sentence is harder and much more useful. Keep cheap debt on schedule if the capital can work harder elsewhere. Sequence moderate debt around match liquidity and compounding. Destroy toxic consumer debt with fire. That is the hierarchy. It is not emotionally satisfying in the way a slogan is. It is much more profitable. The source material uses the avalanche method, prioritizing the highest rate first, as the preferred attack strategy for expensive consumer debt. That is mathematically correct because the costliest rate is the one doing the most damage each month. Fayfellowsite Fayturn 66 File 0 Fay. Exactly. When the debt is poisonous, you stop caring about emotional wins and start caring about damage control. Highest rate first, every extra dollar there. Minimums on the rest, subscriptions cut, waste trimmed. Extra income found. The point is not elegance, it is removal. And once the poison is gone, you do not celebrate by becoming stupid again. You celebrate by redirecting the freed cash flow into ownership. Now let me say something plainly because a lot of people need to hear it. Being debt-free is not the goal. Being free is the goal. Those are different things. A person can have no debt and still have no serious assets, no meaningful liquidity, no passive income, no leverage, and no compounding machine. Meanwhile, another person can hold cheap fixed liabilities, strong liquid reserves, tax-advantaged accounts, and broad productive assets. Who is stronger? The answer is obvious. The source text says this outright as well: debt. Free and wealthy are not synonyms. Many broke people are debt. Free in the technical sense, but own almost nothing, while many truly wealthy people carry cheap, strategic debt alongside large productive asset bases. Fayfellowsite Fayturn 66 File 0 Fay. That distinction matters so much that I want to repeat it another way. The middle class often seeks cleanliness. The wealthy seek spread, optionality, and productive ownership. Cleanliness feels good. Productive ownership changes your life. You must decide what trophy you are chasing. If your trophy is, I owe nothing, you may get there and still have very little. If your trophy is, my money owns enough productive assets that my life no longer depends entirely on my labor, then you will think very differently about which liabilities deserve aggression and which deserve patience. That is the mental shift. Now let me tell you the complete framework as cleanly as I can. If the debt is cheap, fixed, and below roughly 5%, it often sits low on the attack list, while extra dollars go toward better, returning uses. If the debt is moderate federal student debt, it often stays on minimums while you first capture match, build reserves, and start tax-advantaged compounding. If the debt is a low-rate, sensible auto loan, it usually stays on schedule for the same reason. If the debt is high-interest consumer poison, you stop philosophizing and you kill it. Then every liberated dollar starts doing better work, match, reserve, Roth, 401k, broad market ownership, cash flowing productive assets where appropriate. That is the capital hierarchy. That is how the wealthy think. Not because they are emotionally cold, because they understand the true cost of money. The source document closes by urging viewers to ask simple but crucial questions. What is the interest rate? What return could my capital earn elsewhere? Am I attacking expensive debt or merely wasting money on cheap debt? Those are exactly the right questions. Fayfellowsite Fayturn 66 File 0 Fay. That is the real education. Not complicated, just rare. Most people never ask those questions. They react, they overpay the wrong thing, they feel proud, they stay stuck. You do not have to. So here is the final truth. People do not stay broke because they have debt. A great many people stay broke because they do not understand which debt deserves their aggression and which debt deserves only their discipline. They spend years killing the cheap liabilities and starving the productive assets. They call that prudence. The math calls it something else. It calls it misallocation. And misallocation, repeated over years, is one of the most expensive habits in the world. So here is the final choice. You can keep treating all debts as one ugly pile, keep throwing extra dollars at whatever makes you feel cleaner, keep underfeeding the investment side, and keep hoping responsible feelings eventually turn into wealth. That is what most people will do. Or you can do the harder thing. You can price every liability. Honestly, stop overfeeding the cheap mortgage. Stop sacrificing your best compounding years just to erase moderate federal loans too early. Stop rushing to kill cheap auto debt for emotional reasons. Take the employer match. Build real liquidity. Use the Roth. Use the 401k. Buy productive assets. And then turn around and annihilate high-interest consumer debt with total seriousness. That is the correct order. Not because it is edgy, because it is true. And once you finally understand the hierarchy, money stops being a moral puzzle and starts becoming what it always should have been, a capital allocation problem. That is when real wealth begins. Not when the balance sheet looks the cleanest, when the capital starts working in the right order. That is the difference. And over a lifetime, that difference can be worth far more than most people will ever realize until it is too late.